We're here at entry 21, which covers the week of April 20th. This is a little over 2 pages, this entry. Tell us what's significant here.
This was the memo that we shortly followed the visit to Mexico City, and it reports on a visit that David Slauson and I made to the State Department. One aspect that we wanted to follow up was how the Cuban government actually treated the application on behalf of Oswald for a transit visa. The State Department was always cooperative with our requests. They usually evaluated whether there was any downside to the inquiries that we were making. And on this case, they were perfectly ready to file an appropriate request through channels and see whether the Cuban government would forward to us their internal documents with respect to the handling of his request. And indeed, the request was made, and there was a response from the Cuban embassy that we were able to deal with in the report. David was a very good member of the staff in the sense that he knew when he had to get up and go outside and do something and visit with the State Department, initiate contacts of that kind. And he carried the burden in this area, as I mentioned before. I think there came a point where I asked one of our so-called associates that we had on board to help him out. I forget whether it was Stuart Pollock or Richard Mosk. I want to talk about those individuals at some point. Stuart Pollock was a former Supreme Court clerk from Harvard who I had hired for the Criminal Division as a special assistant to Jack Miller. It became a practice within the Kennedy Justice Department that every Assistant Attorney General hire someone who had served on the Supreme Court to be an assistant for a year or two. Clerks coming from the Supreme Court are always reluctant to make any immediate decision as to whether they're going to academia or into private practice, so they're eager to look for some other short-term assignment that will provide an extension of their experience in the profession and where they're able to provide some public service. So, in fact, I hired 3 such people during my tenure. They were, by accident, all Harvard graduates. And each of them was proved to have a stunningly good career in the profession. And Stuart was the second one I had hired, and actually had stayed for a second year and was doing some work at the nearby U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, so he could get some experience in trying cases. And I asked him early on in the history of the Warren Commission whether he would come on board, and he said no, he was enjoying what he was doing in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And a month or two later, I said, in essence, Stuart, I need you. And he came over, and he, quiet demeanor, very thoughtful, very productive, an excellent writer, terrific colleague in all regards. He went on to a distinguished career and was one of the 3 members of the commission staff that ended up on the judiciary. And he was a member of the Court of Appeals in California in San Francisco.
Was Pollock assigned to any particular area?
No, he wasn't. That's why I moved him around where the need was. And I think at some point he did do significant work with David Slauson in this area. And just like our first associate, so to speak, was Richard Mosk, who was the son of a former Attorney General for California and a family well known to the Chief Justice. Richard had a stunning career at Stanford undergraduate school and at Harvard Law School. And he reported for duty in as early as February and was put to work for a large portion of his time in the Area 3, working with Burt Jenner, trying to develop memoranda with respect to all aspects of Oswald's history before Russia, during the Russian, and post-Russian. And Richard was a great contributor, very hard worker, had to leave for military service, I think, later in the summer. So those were 2 of the so-called associates that came on board, and they all met our needs and worked very, very hard.
On the second page of this entry, there's a large paragraph that deals again with preparations as you began to contemplate publishing the final report. There's a quote here I want to read. Mr. Rankin, apparently expressing the concerns of the Commission, opined that we should not cite materials in the final report which are not simultaneously published. And that kind of gets back to the thought we were talking about earlier about wanting to have all the supplementary materials there for all the critics and researchers to flip through.
This was a continuation of that debate, and there was general agreement that what's in the report should be documented, and so the question really is, well, it would be impossible to get everything, including all the transcripts, published simultaneously with release of the report. So you had to draw a line between those evidentiary materials that could be produced and published simultaneously with the report, leaving open the question of how soon you could get the remaining materials, like the transcripts, into publication form. As you know, the end result was to produce a report with extensive footnotes and documentation, but at the same time it took 2 months to produce the 26 volumes that included all the evidentiary materials. The end result of this discussion, because I felt that Rankin's expression of the Commission's concern might result in too little being cited, and therefore sort of defeating my objective of trying to get as much as possible into the original final report as footnotes or as an appendix of some kind. And the end result sort of was a compromise, with Rankin telling staff to immediately get marked as exhibits anything that they wanted to cite in their section of the report, so that it could then be included as supporting material. So we worked it out, but it was important to have this kind of discussion, and here we were. I guess we're in April by this time, and increasingly now the lawyers are concerned with concluding their investigation, dealing with further depositions, helping the Commission hear testimony from important witnesses, and beginning to write up sections in their area that might ultimately be a part of the final report.
In the paragraph above that, you mentioned the GPO, which stands for Government Printing Office. There may be those who don't quite understand what the Government Printing Office is and does. Maybe you could talk
Right. Well, the Government Printing Office was the place where government documents were to be produced, and obviously our assignment was going to be one of the most difficult for the GPO. I don't think they realized at the beginning that we were going to publish not only an extensive report, but we were going to ask them to publish the volumes that contained all the evidentiary material from transcripts and other evidence that was considered by the Commission. So the printing in those days was a very rigorous and difficult task. It involved using the traditional methods at the time, which had been in existence for decades, and involved using hot lead into galleys that would shape the initial version of what they were printing, called galley proofs, and then those galley proofs would be reviewed, and changes would be made, and then the printer would have to adjust and reconstruct an appropriate set of leaden bars to be printed upon, and they would produce page proofs, which then were further reviewed. And it was a process that at some point argued strongly against detailed fine editing, because there came a time at which the need to change a footnote, for example, would require changing the numbers of all footnotes, which would mean doing the entire page or galley over again. And in any event, these were technical problems that are probably beyond the understanding of people today, and they were a very difficult obstacle. We had a very good man at GPO that we dealt with, and he felt it was an extraordinary process, and he saw a good deal of me in that process. I don't know exactly why, and the reason I mention it is that when I left the Department of Justice in 1965, I went to serve as executive director of a presidential commission on crime in the District of Columbia. And as I've said in the book, I think no one in their right mind ever does two presidential commissions. I did the second only because Jack Miller, who was then in private practice, was asked by President Johnson to be the chairman of a 9-person commission to look at the serious issues in the criminal system in the District of Columbia. In any event, near the end of that 16-month project, I had to go to the government printing office. And when I saw the same man I had worked with, and he said, "Oh my God, not Howard Willens again with a job for a GPO." So he remembered me not too fondly, but he did good work as always in producing the report of the President's Commission on Crime in the District of Columbia.
I know we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the publishing of the final report in later entries.